Hello, this section of Revelation is a section that has a bunch of fun stuff in it. Beasts, a woman, a child, and a dragon. So we're going to take a look at this and do an overview of Revelation chapter 12 through 14. My name is Amy, and I am glad that you've joined us here today. So instead of trying to interpret these chapters of Revelation, I'm just going to offer some thoughts on what stood out to me, a few reminders, but mostly we're going to discuss what the first readers of Revelation may have thought when they heard John's words. So a few reminders before we dive into these chapters. First and foremost, remember Revelation is all about Jesus, revealing who he is, how he conquers sin, death, and the devil, and how we are participants in that victory. So if you find yourself being tempted to try to crack the code of Revelation or figure out how each chapter fits into an end times timeline, I just ask you and remind you to set that aside. Remember, the entire purpose of Revelation is to glorify Jesus, not to provide us with a code or a map of the end times. Lots of things in Revelation are cyclical and overlapping and theme-oriented. Apocalyptic writers didn't feel bound to write in chronological order. Also, remember that there's many ways to interpret Revelation. Let's not argue about the right way. Our best bet is to ask two questions. One, how does this text glorify Jesus? And what can I learn about him through it? And the second question would be, how would the first readers have connected with this passage? So, since we are so far removed from the first readers, we can check commentaries written by people who have researched and studied the historical background of the Bible to get a better understanding of the lens through which the first readers would have read this letter. Now, on to chapter 12, the woman, the child, and the dragon. The cool thing here is that the first readers would have been really familiar with the language and images in this story. They were used for Greek and Egyptian stories, and the first readers would have been familiar with them. And these stories used dragons and other elements that John has put into chapter 12. So he uses these familiar images to illustrate Jesus' victory over Satan, which is just really cool. Let's check out verse 1 in chapter 12. It says, "A great and wondrous sign appeared in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head." So most people agree that the woman here represents Israel. The first readers would have identified her as the 12 tribes of Israel by the sun, moon, and the 12 stars. Then John tells us in verse 9 that the dragon in the story is Satan. And if you read through chapter 12, you'll see that the woman gives birth. And the birth of the child probably refers not to Jesus' birth, but to his death and resurrection and his messianic enthronement. So if you want to look into this further, I'd encourage you to check out Psalm 2, verse 6 through 9, Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, and Micah chapter 5, verse 3. In the story, there is this reference to 1,260 days. And so as we look at this, we just want to remember that we're not used to apocalyptic literature. Symbolic numbers are common in this genre, though. Likely this number has more to do with the kind of time frame than the length of time frame that John is referring to here. Early readers would have recognized John reusing or referencing the Great Tribulation that Daniel talks about in Daniel 12, verse 11. It was common practice by authors to use the language of older prophecies in their writings and then reference it. So both verse 6 in chapter 12 and verse 14, likely the original readers would have seen this time frame as a reference to the age between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. All right, take a deep breath. We are moving on to the beasts. So there's the beast out of the sea and the beast out of the earth, and they're referenced in chapter 13 of Revelation. Really, I believe this whole section can be summed up by with the second part of verse 10. It says this: "This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints." Again, that's chapter 13, verse 10, and the second part of verse 10. The whole section is about standing firm in the face of persecution and the temptation to give in to idolatry and the system of the world, and offer allegiance to the world in order to gain economic rights. There are many nuances and puzzles in chapter 13 that many of us have tried to figure out. And there's lots of questions like, is the beast a reference to the Antichrist? What does it mean that he was healed of a fatal wound? Has the beast already come, or is he yet to come? Is this a one-time event, or have there been many beasts throughout history? Is the mark of the beast symbolic, or is it a literal mark? And what is the name 666 supposed to refer to? As I was reading up in the preparation for this overview, one of the things that stood out to me most was the idea that the early readers would have undoubtedly thought of Nero when they read about the beast. It's this idea that they would have easily identified someone who had taken on the characteristics of the beast here in chapter 13. Nero was someone that had demanded worship and who had persecuted believers in terrible and frightful ways. The early readers would have also been very familiar with restrictions on economic opportunities if you failed to take part in the worship of your patron god of your city. So it was helpful to me to understand that the early readers would have easily identified people and world systems with the beasts in chapter 13. This makes the encouragement that they received to remain faithful all the more relevant and important. It also leads us into chapter 14. So, apocalyptic literature often contrasts the righteous with the wicked. And the transition between chapter 13 and 14 is a really great example of that. Because in chapter 14, we have suddenly the Lamb and the 144,000. With the constant and real threat of persecution and martyrdom comes the call to remain faithful. So here we see the rise of the 144,000, those who have remained faithful to Jesus. Just a note, remember that symbolic numbers were standard fare in Jewish apocalyptic literature. So we see that the 144,000, they have the name of the Father written on their foreheads. And that's in direct contrast to the mark of the beast in the previous verses. The 144,000 have remained faithful. And they're celebrating this in the first half of chapter 14. And then we move on to their vindication. The rest of the chapter then paints a picture of the end of the suffering of the martyrs and the judgment of their oppressors. You know, we're often really uncomfortable with the idea of God's judgment against evil. But we need to remember that justice, salvation, and deliverance were never complete in the Old Testament without vindication. But we also need to remember that God's timeline is not like our own. When I'm reading through this and I'm thinking about the judgment, I'm reminded of 2 Peter 3:9, and it says this: "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise," that is his promise to return, "as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." As we await Jesus' return, I think we should take our cue from Revelation chapter 14, verse 12. And this is what it says: "This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus."